Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. Our core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring you information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I'll be your host. Today's guest is Dr. David Stevens. He is the author of the new book, Despondency, The Real Pandemic. Dr. Stevens, it's such an honor to have you on the show. I would love for you just to kind of take a moment and just kind of tell a little bit about yourself. I know you run a very busy practice. You also have a ministry, and in addition to a huge amount of education, certification courses that you do. If you don't mind just kind of letting the audience know who you are, I would love that.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. I very much appreciate it. And so a little bit about my background. I am trained as a clinical psychologist and a neuropsychologist, and have done clinical psychology and neuropsychology in my practice throughout my career. I spent a good amount of time doing work in jails and prisons. I've been the director of mental health for 3 state departments of correction, and also provided and have overseen mental health services in a number of jails across the country. I'm currently doing a fair amount of what's called the neuroscience of architecture. So working with architects as they design jails and prisons, so those facilities are promoting healing and reducing stress instead of the opposite. And given the way the brain functions, and given trauma and life experience, which we'll talk more about a little bit later, but as those things happen, that increases the stress level of both the people who are incarcerated as well as the people who are staff members. And so changing even the design of facilities is a very important thing. But most of what I do these days, I still do a fair amount of correctional mental health consulting, but really am focused on brain rehabilitation. And that is my professional work and my ministry primarily, is helping people, helping their brains recover from injuries, which we'll talk more about, from psychological trauma and various life events. So that is really very much what I'm devoting my time to. I do train and certify people to provide the brain rehabilitation that we'll talk about as well.
Wonderful. I'm curious, before we get into kind of the main subject, what are some of the kind of principles when you design a correctional facility that makes it friendlier or more conducive to a better mental state? What are some of the main principles that you've seen?
One of the very interesting ones is most of the time people who are arrested and sent to jail or prison have a very bad life experience with buildings of any sort. So many times their apartment or townhouse or mobile home or even single-family home, a lot of trauma and abuse happened in those environments. And then school buildings very seldom were places of joy and satisfaction and fulfillment. It was more criticism and failure. And then courts, of course, were places of trauma. Jails, even juvenile detention facilities and jails and prisons are places associated with a lot of pain and failure and trauma. So we're working to design facilities so the outside does not look institutional in any way. We don't want it to look like a school. We don't want it to look like a court. We don't want it to look like even an office building, but probably closer to a hotel, which people have less experience and less traumatic experience with. So as they're driving to being driven to the facility, they're not looking at this foreboding, ominous structure and being reminded of the many traumatic experiences they've had in buildings throughout their life. So that's one of them. Light is a very, very important issue. Any kind of lighting, or most kinds of lighting, particularly fluorescent lighting, results in increased headaches for people that have had concussive injuries, other brain difficulties, and psychological trauma. And so the way the lights are structured, how much light comes in, makes a big difference in terms of whether they have increased tinnitus or ear ringing, whether they have increased headaches, whether they have increased anxiety. The placement of windows, both internal windows and interior and exterior windows, makes a big difference. Many times, and particularly military veterans, they are so used to having to not be near a window because of the possibility of incoming gunfire. And even people who have been involved in gangs and had traumatic experiences, the placement of windows can really increase their stress or decrease their stress. And there's a bunch of other things, but those are some of the maybe more obvious examples.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So with the windows, because you always think that you'd want a big window so you can look out and be, kind of experience the world outside. But what you're saying, it's almost the opposite for this group of people, that they need to feel safe away from the window in a way.
Yes, exactly. And they do need the natural light, but they also need to not be in a place that is going to heighten what's called hypervigilance, or them being constantly aware and looking for danger.
Yeah, that's incredible. So your ministry, and this was one of the things that really caught my eye when I it was actually a patient of mine that is that we share, that's also a patient of yours, and she was telling me about some of the therapies that you're doing and also the thinking behind it, and it was really fascinating because the brain, obviously, there are so many conditions involved that involves the brain, which is pretty much a majority of them, because if we don't have a brain, how does the rest of the body function? So
Exactly.
And so in your way of looking at the brain, from what I was reading, is a little bit different than what we normally think of the brain. I mean, how in your mind, how does a brain function? I mean, how does that work?
Which is a great question. All of us know intuitively that the brain controls the body. So whether I'm doing a presentation or a training or doing rehabilitation with a specific person in my office, and when I ask people, does the brain control the body, they kind of look at me a little funny and say, well, yes, of course, everybody knows that. But people don't really think about the implications of that and the extent to which the brain controls the body. And so one of the distinctions I make is between macro level of functioning and micro level of functioning. And the vast majority of brain research, the vast majority of psychological research, the vast majority of even, and it's an artificial distinction in my mind, but physical health or medical research, differentiating that from brain research, like I said, I think is artificial to a certain extent. But all of that is focused on micro functions, like in terms of neurology or neuropsychology, what's happening with neurotransmitters, or what's happening with amino acids, or what's happening with oxygen, or what's happening with blood flow. And most conditions, specifically related to the brain, but also related to the body, people focus on the micro level, and we want the specific organ, we want the specific tissue, we want the maybe even a specific system, to function better, but they don't look at the macro level. which is the fueling of the brain. And my work has demonstrated with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that when we focus on the macro level of making sure the brain has adequate fuel, that resolves many, many other what we would think of as brain-specific problems, as well as what we might consider more body-specific problems.
Yeah, because that's actually, I mean, I know even in my work, so I know that I've been at fault the same, looking at, well, do we need to boost the serotonin level? Do we need to boost dopamine? And then using natural agents to do these, do L-tyrosine with B6, and maybe some euconabine, for the tyrosine or for the dopamine, and then 5-HTP or tryptophan, to boost the serotonin, and kind of trying to then support the body in that way. But like you're saying, all these things are just chemical components or more of the mechanical aspect that you're looking at it, but you're coming from a fuel component, and like you were talking about, when I was reading your material, talking about the car. I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, if you don't have fuel, it doesn't matter how much you fix the carburetor, or it's still not going to go anywhere.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So what fuels the brain then? I mean, what do you do in order to? I mean, because obviously it's gasoline and a car. What
right.
is it that fuels the brain?
Glucose is the primary fuel for the brain, and glucose and dextrose are really exactly the same thing. It's just different names for the same substance. But God created us so that our brains have to have glucose, and actually our bodies do as well, in order to function appropriately.
Great. Well, we're going to take actually a little quick break, because I'm going to ask a little bit more about that, because obviously everyone runs away from sugar all the time,
right.
with diabetes and obesity and all of that. So I'm really curious to see how you're going to answer these next questions. We'll be right back. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. David Stevens. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. David Stevens, and we're actually talking about your brain and how to correct the dysfunctions within your brain that can then have implications throughout your whole body, since that obviously is operating unit, the central operating unit in your system. So you're saying then that glucose becomes extremely important. And so are you saying then that the dysfunctions in the brain that we're dealing with is a glucose deficiency?
Yes. And like you referenced right before the break, it's really, in some ways, a difficult concept for people, because we have heard so many times and in so many different ways in our culture and even in the medical, clinical culture, that sugar is bad. That's almost just a given, fundamental truth of the universe. But glucose is a different sugar. Glucose is what's called a monosaccharide, meaning there's one sugar molecule in the chemical makeup of it. And most other sugars that we ingest, fructose and sucrose being the primary examples, are polysaccharides, meaning there's multiple sugars in the chemical makeup. So glucose is a very simple sugar, and in my opinion, and I think there's good research to support this, but that God designed our brains specifically to need glucose in order to function. And like you said with the car, a gasoline internal combustion engine is designed specifically to have gasoline to function. And you could put some other things in there, but the engine would not function nearly as well if it didn't have a certain octane of gasoline.
So, because the old thinking, or I'm not going to say the old thinking, the current thinking, which is different from what you're expressing is that the type of sugar that is released slower is the better sugar, meaning that if there's a conversion factor which then causes the release of the sugar to be slower, so it has a lower glycemic index, so we'll then secrete less insulin in response to the sugar that gets into the bloodstream. If you have too much too quickly, then there's a huge amount of insulin, and insulin is a fat storage hormone, and you become insulin resistant, and you get fat, and you know, on and on and on. So what is your response to that argument?
Yes, and really, glucose does not trigger those processes you're talking about. So getting more glucose, the brain does not store glucose to any significant extent. The body does store glucose primarily in the liver, but also in muscle tissue and even to a certain extent in the bloodstream. But the brain requires glucose for its function, and it requires a steady influx, and it also has to be fully fueled. It has to get enough glucose to function optimally. And so what I've discovered, and I can give you the story about, quote unquote, the discovery of it, but what I've discovered is a variety of events, really anything that activates what's called the sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight system. So a bump on the head will do that. Doesn't even have to be a concussion, but certainly a concussion or a traumatic brain injury will do that. But even just a bump on the head or something seemingly as harmless as, say, somebody screams at you in traffic, or certainly physical abuse, sexual abuse, those kinds of things. Every one of those incidents activates the sympathetic nervous system. When that happens, the brain, and I'll use some non-technical terms, but the brain pulls glucose from the body via the adrenal glands, so it has enough fuel for that fight or flight reaction or to protect you. The normal process of the brain getting glucose and using that glucose for fuel is called glycolysis. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it causes a chemical cascade that results in a process called hyperglycolysis, meaning the brain is getting too much glucose too fast is the result. And even more importantly, theoretically, the brain could drain the body of glucose reserves if this hyperglycolysis continued uninterrupted. So what the brain does then is, in effect, the more technical term is it downregulates, or you could think about it more simply as it kind of turns down the valve to stop the hyperglycolysis, so the brain isn't continuing to draw more and more glucose from the body. Unfortunately, the brain doesn't just do that in the moment. All the available research, except for one article, says that hyperglycolysis lasts about 20 minutes following sympathetic nervous system activation. There's one article that says it can last as long as 4 hours, but generally it's 15, 20 minutes, something like that. So then the brain, quote unquote, turns the valve down to limit the glucose, but it leaves it turned down permanently, theoretically, because it doesn't want to have another episode of hyperglycolysis. But then the next activation of the sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight system happens. The brain, in effect, reopens the valve, more glucose comes in, so it has enough fuel for you to survive for that fight or flight situation. Hyperglycolysis happens, the brain turns the valve down again, only this time it turns it down, it downregulates it a little more. And so the brain gets less glucose. And then the next event, same thing happens. The valve is open, the brain gets more glucose, hyperglycolysis happens, the brain turns it down and turns it down a little more. So every sympathetic nervous system activation, even if you're not aware of it, results in a loss of glucose to the brain on a permanent basis until it's treated appropriately. And I've done lots and lots of research, worked with lots and lots of people where I did neuropsychological testing and found that somebody, even if they said, no, I've never had a concussion, I've never had a head injury, I've not had psychological trauma, and yet they had clinically significant deficits on neuropsychological testing. And then with some more detailed questioning, the history of these glucose-limiting events has emerged. And then when the brain is treated with glucose, those cognitive deficits, physical deficits, emotional difficulties, all of those things go away. And so that's a really long answer, I know, to your question.
No, I mean, that's perfect. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with David Stevens. He is the author of Despondency, The Real Pandemic. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. Stevens, and we're talking about your brain and the impact of trauma, impact of concussions, and you're calling these glucose-limiting events. So it sounds to me almost like, the sum total of these events, it all adds up, and then you develop symptoms because of the impact of the brain not getting enough glucose.
Exactly. Yes.
And so these are, like we were talking about, the sympathetic, parasympathetic. Sympathetic is that kind of fight or flight, or that go active. So when you're in a stress state, you're in that sympathetic. Parasympathetic, you're more in that regenerative, relax. You digest, you detoxify. You're in that state. That's a parasympathetic. So let's say, for instance, we have young kids. They're in sports. They play soccer. And they obviously do headers. Or they get kicked in the head, or they get bumped, or you have somebody playing football or hockey or whatever it may be. And these are things that kids just do when they grow up. And this is what they do for fun. So can these events then have the impact? Then can they create then these brain dysfunctions that you're talking about?
They do, yes. I mean, not every time a kid heads a soccer ball does that activate the sympathetic nervous system, but sometimes when the kid heads the soccer ball, it does create either enough motion of the brain inside the skull or just enough detection of difficulty that activates the sympathetic nervous system, which the brain uses as the protective mechanism. So as I said earlier, there's enough fuel excuse me, for the brain to fight or flee or freeze or do whatever it needs to do to protect itself. And so in my opinion,
does it need to be a traumatic event then associated with it, or just a physical event is enough?
Just the physical event is enough. Like I tell people, if I dropped my pen underneath my desk and I grabbed the pen and then raised up and hit my head on the underside of the drawer of the desk, that can be enough to activate the sympathetic nervous system that then results in the process we talked about that limits glucose to the brain. So it really doesn't have to be very much.
So how would you know? I mean, you have these. Let's say you have these coaches. Their kids. They're playing football. They kind of run into each other. Looks like one get hit pretty hard, and they evaluate this kid, and it seemed fine. I mean, how in your mind how would you detect this kind of event? I mean, how would you properly evaluate that?
Yes. So in the moment, sometimes people will develop a headache, or they might have black spots in their vision, or they might see stars, or they might just feel the adrenaline rush, where kind of feel numb and tense and anxious. So any of those things are indicative of the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Obviously, in more severe injuries, if somebody loses consciousness or can't maintain their balance or forgets where they are, or like in a football game, can't remember the plays or whatever. Those are obviously clearer signs. But due to neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to alternate function across different brain areas, and there's multiple brain areas responsible for nearly every function of our brains. But the first, and it's really imprecise, but the first X number, we'll say just for the sake of the conversation, the first 5 times somebody experiences a glucose-limiting event, the brain can adapt with no apparent loss of function at all. But then what happens is very frequently somebody will have even a minor bump on the head. I've even had a patient that the first time he became aware of having difficulty was he got hit in the head with a hailstone that was pretty small. And all of a sudden he started having perpetual headaches and was having difficulty concentrating. So it's the accumulated nature that results in observable symptoms. Unless it's a very severe injury, most of the time there is an evidence of ongoing problems with the first several or, again, X number of injuries.
So do you feel that the way that these kids are evaluated, I mean, do you feel that that is sufficient in order to kind of protect them against continuation of or kind of a long-term effect from these type of run-ins that they have on the field?
Well, yes, I think diagnosing a concussion, for example, is really not all that difficult. But when there are clinically significant symptoms, including a headache or feeling dizzy or seeing black spots in your vision or stars or whatever, that's indicative that a concussion has happened, and a concussion is certainly a glucose-limiting event.
And then you've used the term called covert concussive syndrome. What is that?
That is kind of what we've been talking about, that somebody can have even a concussive event and yet not recognize it because, I had a headache for a little while, but it went away. Or, I was an assistant high school basketball coach. And a few years ago, we had a player who bumped heads with another player. And he came over and I was asking him some questions. And he said, all of a sudden, my vision I'm getting these big black spots in my vision, and they're getting worse. And that's evidence of a concussion. And then the other part of it is that the symptoms, even if the symptoms go away, the glucose limitation doesn't go away. And so the cumulative nature of a bump, even a minor bump on the head, or like I said, a conflict with somebody, or the more severe abuse or traumatic brain injuries, those don't necessarily demonstrate symptoms, so they're covert the first several times, and then people will get a little bump on the head, and then they'll have permanent or ongoing symptoms until you treat it appropriately.
Yeah, like the little hail pebble that you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm curious, because sometimes you have these covert concussive syndrome, like you're saying. You're not quite aware that you might have a concussive event. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that a person can then develop, so you have the event, is it possible that like years down the line you start to develop more severe symptoms from that event?
Yes. And in my opinion, that's exactly what happens with dementia. I also think that's what happens with diabetes. That's what happens with depression. That's what happens with anxiety. That after or over a period of years, usually, the glucose level or the glucose supply to the brain keeps getting lower and lower and lower and lower. And as the brain has less and less fuel, just like a car engine, if the fuel filter is clogged or if the car isn't getting enough gas, it will start to run worse and worse and worse. And that's exactly what happens with our brains and our bodies.
Yeah, because it has to then compensate. You know, we're not getting enough fuel, so then we have to downregulate the system. So areas that take a lot of fuel, like the brain, will have to downregulate in its function. Yeah, so
right.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. David Stevens. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with David Stevens. He is the author of Despondency, The Real Pandemic. And I actually want to chat a little bit about your book as well, because that in itself is a whole whole interview in itself. but I want to at least chat a little bit about it, because it's such a fascinating subject. So tell me a little bit about these glucose limiting events. I mean, what kind of symptoms can come about from these glucose limiting events? You're mentioning things like diabetes, dementia, anxiety, depression. What are some other things that can come about from this?
Yes, and there's a number of them, and it really has been surprising to me as I've continued to work with more and more people, the array of conditions that are directly attributable to glucose-limiting events. And that includes things like autism. It includes things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, more minor things like difficulty remembering the word you want to use, even though you know what the word is, or going into a room and not remembering why you went into the room. Addiction, anger, violent behavior, all of those things and a number of others, fibromyalgia or autoimmune problems. All those things have their roots, in my opinion, in glucose-limiting events. When the brain isn't fully fueled, it can't regulate itself and it can't regulate the body the way it's designed to.
That's amazing. So in essence, I mean, obviously, like I was mentioning earlier, the brain it's a controlling unit. So if you get rid of the pilot of the plane,
right,
everything's going to go downhill. So,
quickly, another example I use with people is most people are aware that cars have computers now. And so a problem with the operation of your car can be a computer problem, or it can be a mechanical problem, meaning a part broke in half, or a gasket got stretched and now there's leaking. But many times it's a computer problem, even when there's no mechanical problem at all. And that's exactly what happens in what we're talking about. Many, many, many times it's a computer or a brain problem, not a bodily system or mechanical problem.
Oh, okay. So in your work, because you've been able to help hundreds and hundreds of people dealing, with these type of conditions and really severe conditions that's caused by these glucose-limiting events. What are some of the main principles in your treatment to be able to correct this?
The biggest one, and I would say there's two primary ones, but the biggest one is we can fuel the brain with glucose separate from or independent from the digestive pathway, which is the normal way the brain gets glucose. So glucose is something a person can get over the counter with, at Walgreens or Walmart or whatever. And by taking glucose, that gets to the brain via a different glucose transport mechanism. I joke with people sometimes that I haven't been able to get anyone to volunteer for a lumbar puncture. And so we don't know exactly which glucose transport mechanism is getting glucose to the brain separate from that dietary pathway, which is the one that's limited by the brain. But by taking glucose, we bypass the limitation. The brain gets fully fueled. And for most people, when it's been fueled for about 6 months, their symptoms go away. Again, whether it's diabetes, blood sugar regulates, and they're able to stop taking insulin. If it's a mental health issue, they can stop taking their antidepressants and they don't have any more depression. The memory problems go away. All of that goes away when the brain has gotten fully fueled. And then after about 6 months, the brain takes away the limitation from the dietary pathway. They go back to getting their brain fueled fully just from their diet and then can stop taking the glucose.
So it's almost like you're then forcing by, bypassing the digestive process of supplying glucose and just going directly out through the bloodstream. It's almost like you're then forcing these channels open by continually putting pressure with the glucose.
That could be the mechanism. Honestly, again, I've not been able to have anybody do a lumbar puncture study to see exactly how that's happening. But I think a big part of it is mucosal absorption, but I'm not certain of that.
No. But at the end of the day, what you've seen, it works.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And it's amazing. Like one of the very first people I treated, I said to him, and so maybe just a really quick departure, this is a treatment or this is a process that was inspired by God. I was doing a lot of research on concussions and brain function and was literally awakened in the middle of the night in October of 2017 with the thought, try glucose. And so I researched it to make sure it was safe. And then one of the early people, I said to him, I have no idea if this will help. I do know for sure it won't hurt you. Would you like to try some glucose tablets? And he said, sure. And probably 30 seconds or less after taking 3 or 4 tablets, he turned to his wife and he said, that pressure that's always in my head? And she said, yes. And he said, it's gone. And then I started having people report that in terms of headaches and tinnitus and a variety of things of very rapid assimilation or absorption of glucose to the brain by taking it that way.
That's fascinating. So, and what kind of dosages are we talking about? I mean, is it
when most people hear it, they would say relatively high. So, for an adult, I typically recommend that they start by taking 24 grams at a time, 4 times a day. And the 4 times a day is kind of back to the automobile example. If your engine is running for quite a while, you will get progressively lower on fuel. Being alive burns glucose. And so after several hours, typically you've gotten low on glucose because, like I said a little while ago, the brain does not store glucose in any significant amount. So 3 or 4 hours later, often people have symptoms start to come back again, which is their brain telling them you're low on glucose and you need to refuel.
Yeah, that's right. And this is something, do you kind of gradually increase, or do you just kind of stay at that dosage and that should be enough?
No, have to gradually increase. You cannot take enough to be certainly can't take enough to kill you. That's physically impossible. And you also can't take enough to be harmful. The worst case scenario is if you took too much, you'd probably vomit. But so, yeah, just based on symptom reduction, then I will have people increase the amount they're taking until we've eliminated all symptoms. And sometimes it can take 4 or 5 months to eliminate symptoms for a variety of reasons. But I've not had anybody that completed treatment not fully recover.
And this is, you're talking about anxiety, neurological conditions, autism, autoimmune conditions, and diabetes even.
Yes.
Yeah, because that's so counterintuitive, because diabetes, you're thinking that, that's too much sugar, and here you're feeding them sugar or glucose, and that corrects their diabetes.
Right, but what we're doing is fueling their brain, and so what happens is, in my opinion, and I've seen this in dozens and dozens and dozens of people with diabetes, that because, as we've talked about, there's a glucose limitation due to these glucose-limiting events. So then the brain is fairly continuously activating the liver or even muscle tissue to release stored glucose, which is called glycogen. And so the brain it understands, or it identifies that it's low on glucose. It also understands that the way it gets glucose typically is through the dietary pathway or through activation of the liver to release stored glucose. And so the brain is frequently, if not continuously, draining or tapping into reserves of glucose in the body so it can get more glucose, and yet it's limiting how much it lets in. So that creates a condition of perpetual glucose in the blood, and you have elevated blood sugar levels, which is diabetes. As the brain regulates, and as it gets more fully fueled and then regulates itself, it stops activating the liver and other body parts to release stored glucose, and so then there's less glucose in the blood.
It's fascinating. Well, we're actually going to have to, if you don't mind, I would love to do a show on your book, Despondency, the Real Pandemic, because I'm really fascinated in the impact of the pandemic that we're dealing with right now, not just the virus impact, but the kind of the social impact, and also what it does to people's brains and so forth. So I'd love to have you back at some point to chat about that, because what we talked about now kind of sets the stage for that, from what I understand.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And just a very, very brief comment on that. So despondency is a result of glucose limitation. Yeah, exactly. And these are, right now we've dealt with a global trauma, right.
and that is being perpetuated through the media, which is then creating these, glucose-limiting events, which will then cause anxiety, depression, and all these other health conditions that you're saying that can be correlated with that. So it's just fascinating. Well, Dr. Stevens, it was such a pleasure to have you on the show today, and it's really fascinating, what you're bringing forth, because I remember in the days when fats were bad and everybody was staying away from fats, and then all of a sudden that's the best thing ever, which is what it is.
Right.
And now it seems like we're about to do another paradigm shift, where everyone is saying stay away from sugar, and you're saying the opposite. But again, it's the correct sugar and then in the correct fashion, and that becomes the key, from what I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yep, you're completely right. Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. It's been a pleasure. It's really been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. That is it for today. You're listening to Health Made Radio. Remember, check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. 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 Is what you make it.